I spent 4 years quietly building a monument out of his lies. They told me love and business shouldn't mix. But then Oliver Beck walked into my life. We met at a small design incubator in the city. He was a curator of contacts, a man who could make warm introductions that felt like favors and drop compliments that sounded like investments. I was running on caffeine and conviction, designing sustainable furniture from reclaimed urban materials. In my mind, my value lived in the things I could make, like sturdy chairs, lamps with stories, and small tables that refused to be just decor. Oliver saw more than the chairs. We fell into the easiest partnership, romantic and professional in one. Neat knot. He presented our prototype to a local investor as our creation. He wrote the grant applications with my sketches in his folder. He never once wrote his name on the fine print until the fine print needed signatures. Then, when a small guardrail of contract language might have saved me, he shrugged and said, "We'll sort it after the launch." We did the launch and the chairs sold out in a weekend. The local press loved the story about a 2-person team rebuilding a city's waste. Photos of us sitting on prototypes, laughing as if this was the easiest thing in the world, followed us into magazines. People wrote us checks with promises attached. When the first check bounced, Oliver had an excuse. When the second investor asked for formal incorporation, Oliver suggested a friendly shell company, easier to manage, taxes and all. When I asked him if he'd sign my name too, he said, "You can be the face. Let me do the heavy lifting." The heavy lifting, it turned out, had shoulders that belonged only to his resume. He introduced me as Amelia, our design lead, but when contracts were drafted, the verbs turned, "Oliver Beck does hereby agree." 2 months after our first nationwide feature, what felt like success slammed into me like a bus. Oliver had signed investor terms that gave him controlling interest. He'd set up accounts, representatives, and a legal address in a different zip code. He'd also introduced our idea to a larger manufacturer and whispered a version of the story where my contributions were assistance rather than origin. The betrayal was slow burning. It started as omission and became a pattern, emails that stopped including me, invoices I never saw, and meetings where I was kept in the loop, but never briefed on outcomes. I got the dread of artists who watch their names fade out of the credits. When I finally pushed back and demanded the documents that showed I still had ownership, he told me I was being dramatic. He called me protective and emotional in front of people who mattered. It was when he called me saying he had restructured the company without telling me that the cold set in for good. My name wasn't on the board. My title was listed as creative consultant. The bank statements revealed a string of transfers to accounts in his name. The manufacturer contract bore a clause that gave the other company exclusive rights to our product line for 10 years. There was one moment of grace. A local friend from the incubator offered help. Marisol had watched the marginalization happen. She printed copies of our early emails and suggested I see a lawyer. The lawyer was honest and dry. I had moral rights, but legal ownership was messy without papers that showed I had been assigned share. Oliver had foreseen that. So I left. I took a few lamps, a couple of chairs that no one would miss, and boxes of receipts. I left the studio he kept and rented a small, sunless studio in a neighborhood that smelled of laundromats and diesel. I began to rebuild on terms I could afford. People asked why I hadn't sued. The answer was both simple and ridiculous. We were young. I trusted people would see the truth. And the cost of litigation could ruin a small creative career. For almost 3 years, I did the boring work of survival. I took odd freelance gigs, small set builds, refurbishing thrift store finds, and teaching workshops. I watched the product line he had stolen be rebranded and rewritten into glossy catalogs. Each time the name Beck & Co. reminded me of what I had lost. The idea for revenge arrived the way small obsessions do. Quietly, as a seed. Something that used his public image that he had so carefully curated and turned it into a scaffold for the truth. Something poetic. If he had built his success on a glossy facade, I decided I would build something that exposed it. I didn't have money. Then, I had time, stubbornness, small favors, and city detritus. I had a heap of letters that, to me, were evidence. I had a quiet knowledge of how images traveled on social media. I had a reputation among the local community as someone who could salvage. The UNSAL via GEABLE. It started with a glint of a plan. If I could not recover the company through legal fights without money, I could fight the myth. If enough people saw the wiring, the myth would short out. So I used the only resources left to me to begin building what I would later come to call a monument. Not of stone, but of public, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. That winter, while Oliver accepted an award from the city's Chamber of Commerce and posed in photographs with the mayor, I gathered the first piece of my monument, the gilded promotional mask he'd worn in interviews. It was soft, petty, and symbolic. That was the beginning. The thing about revenge that people forget is how often it's built out of small, ordinary actions. It rarely looks cinematic until the very end. Mostly it looks like paperwork, patience, and asking favors. First, I organized the documents into a timeline. Dates, timestamps, receipts, and screenshots became a backbone. Each email thread I could find was printed and double-checked. I reached out to former contractors and asked them to confirm who had signed what. Marisol contacted a friend who'd worked on the original prototypes. He corroborated my earliest production photos. Collectively, they wrote short affidavits. Not legal yet, but something. Next, I thought about the spectacle. Oliver's world was all about award nights, glossy magazine spreads, and staged photos of him standing on the corner of a reimagined cityscape. Everything about him was polished. So, I would make something visual too, but with the truth baked into its materials. I started collecting materials from the city. People sell junk or they give it away. I asked friends to donate the small ornaments. That said, Best Startup, Innovator of the Year, and Top Curator. People are oddly ready to give away trophies once the ceremony is over. They don't like trophies much more than the ego that earned them. The first large item I acquired was one of his award plaques. A friend in a nonprofit bought a plaque at a thrift event and recognized the logo. I drove across town at midnight to pick it up in a rainstorm. I remember holding it in my car and thinking how weighty the thing felt. Not in physical terms so much as in symbolism. I designed the sculpture around the mask idea. I wanted to create an object that could be placed in public spaces. Something that would be photographed, commented on, and then, crucially, interrogated. The structure would be a frame made from reclaimed metal. Inside it, I would mount trophies, plaques, and frames from his public life. At the center would be a gilded face mask, the exact glossy portrait that had appeared in interview spreads. The artist in me wanted form. The plot in me wanted message. At the core of every polished portrait would be a jumble of work that had been done by others. But I didn't want the sculpture to be merely accusatory. I wanted it to be poetic. The central mask would be designed to peel away slowly, revealing the wiring from behind, and, attached to that wiring, documents. I planned for it to have interactive panels people could pull to reveal things they couldn't ignore. The sculpture would be both a reveal and a question. Who builds the image? And at what cost? Designing it took months. I sketched late into nights, using cheap coffee and the light from a desk lamp. I taught myself how to weld with an evening course and leaned on a retired metalworker named Theo who worked down the block. He liked that I wasn't trying to build a shrine of anger. He liked that I wanted art to do something useful. We scavenged the city's cast-offs. The base was a bench formed out of the legs of a cafe that had closed. The frame was an old scaffolding brace. The mask was plated out of mirrored signage. The panels where I planned to place the documents were salvaged frames, glass replaced with plexiglass. I also needed a platform to tell the story. In the age of social media, an image is memory. I decided the reveal had to be at a place where Oliver's name would already be present, a public gala where he felt untouchable. He had become the darling of corporate philanthropy, and there was an annual City Innovators Gala whose guest list read like a who's who of the networks that had reinforced his myth. Attending the gala plainly was not an option. I had no tickets and no sponsors. But I didn't need to be inside the ballroom to be where he was. Since his rise, he'd done something else. He liked to unveil things. He liked spectacle. So did his PR team. They loved unexpected stunts that could be photographed as spontaneous. I needed to make my stunt look like it was part of the day's visual noise. I applied for a permit to display a public art installation 2 blocks from the gala venue. The permit office asked for sketches, materials, and insurance. I presented our welding plans, the recycled materials list, and a short artist's statement about reframing urban narratives. They approved it after questions and a small fee. The hardest part was keeping calm. Revenge, in reality, is a long game of patience. I met with new friends at coffee shops and banged out emails. I did the mundane bookkeeping I had ignored during the months of anger. I reinforced relationships with people who had been quietly harmed by the same mechanism. People whose work had been credited to others, contractors who hadn't been paid, and interns whose ideas were quoted without attribution. We formed a network of people who, like me, remembered the details. Months later, the sculpture sat in a small warehouse, half-finished and humming with the idea it wanted to become. There, in the blue light filtering through the dusty windows, I taped the first document to display, a design file with my name embedded in the metadata, and a version history showing edits only I had made. It felt like laying a foundation stone. I kept building. The sculpture grew into something that was not just an object but an argument, framed and ready to be placed in the city's sightlines. The night before the gala, I painted the final panel. With the phrase I wanted people to read, "The mask peels away." It was simple. It was brutal. It was legal. It was beautiful. And, for the first time in almost 4 years, it felt like I was holding the story again. My plan was simple in outline and complicated in execution. Place the sculpture 2 blocks from the gala entrance. Make it visible to the crowd leaving the event. Make sure press photographers and the city's social feeds caught it. Time it so that the unveiling coincided with the moment Oliver exited the gala for a staged photo op. Show the documents in the panels as pull-open tabs. Use the city's permit to prevent immediate removal. Livestream the moment. I had the advantage of the city's rhythm. The gala always spilled into the street at the same hour. People smoked on the sidewalk and cabs idled. The city's social pages queued up their photos of well-known faces in coats. I cut my hair short and wore a coat that made me look like I belonged on an art walk. I had printed t-shirts for a handful of volunteers that read, "Ask who signs the checks." And they stood casually, mobile phones at the ready. The sculpture was installed at dawn when the city was slow. Theo drove his pickup with the final pieces. Volunteers and I bolted the base to the pavement using the bolts the permit required. It was a small but useful protection against someone moving it without notice. We staged the panels so that, when pulled, they would reveal copies of documents with clear headers, dates, and provenance. The originals sat with the lawyer and NARISO. At dusk, as the gala lights warmed the building facades and people in gowns drifted out into the cooling night, the sculpture waited like a patient actor backstage. Oliver's PR team had arranged for him to make a short exit through the side entrance. He liked to avoid the throngs. The fewer hands in the handshake photos, the cleaner the image. I watched him emerge on a live feed I had arranged with a sympathetic local blogger. He looked elegant and tired. He was flanked by a PR manager and a photographer. A small crowd of well-wishers cheered with the familiarity of ritual. He posed, smiling in a way that says, "I've been practiced." When someone in the crowd turned and saw the sculpture, her reaction rippled like a dropped stone. Cameras shifted and Oliver's photographer noticed the commotion with professional reflex. And with professional reflex, he pointed his lens. A woman tugged at the plexiglass of the first panel, and it swung open like the cover of a book. Inside, copies of emails were displayed. The first was the timeline of the prototype with metadata that suggested who had drafted the core designs. The second was a copy of the manufacturer contract with the clause giving exclusive rights highlighted. It was the clause Oliver had negotiated and never mentioned to me. The third was an affidavit from someone at the incubator who confirmed they'd seen my sketches months before the launch. People read. They took photos. Phones raised. A local influencer with 20,000 followers live-streamed the display. and narrated what she saw. Look, it says here, design file, Amelia Design File V3. That's a name. This is... wow. News moves fast in small cities. I watched the feed climb. People around the sculpture began talking in short sentences. That turned into commentary. Someone whispered, "Is that Oliver Beck's plaque?" Another person read the artist's statement we'd filed with the permit, a public reconsideration of curated narratives. It sounded highbrow and awkward, which I liked. Oliver, who'd been about to step into a cab, froze. He turned, smiled. Initially, then narrowed his eyes. He walked towards the crowd, toward the sculpture, and I could tell that movement was a decision. A man only walks toward something if he's going to either claim it or extinguish it. As he approached, a line of my volunteers slipped away from the edge and into the crowd, not shouting but pointing, and effectively steering cameras. I left myself among those with phones, pretending to be a passerby. My hands trembled. I told myself it was because of the cold. Oliver reached the sculpture and the photographer with him immediately pointed his lens at one of the panels. Oliver looked down, jaw moving minutely. He bent to examine the panel like a man studying a menu he hadn't ordered from, eyes skimming lines he preferred to ignore. A few people read aloud the highlighted clause. Someone asked, "Did you sign this, Oliver?" He smiled. A practiced curve. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said loudly. Which is a curious thing in a man who profits from making things tidy. His PR manager came forward with a phone and said, "We have individuals looking into this. Those claims are unsubstantiated." He turned to the photographer, a gesture that said, "Take my picture and the camera will side with me." Then something small and precise happened. One of the panels swung more widely than intended, and a photocopy slipped out and fluttered to the pavement. It bore the metadata I had obscured for months, timestamps showing the original sketches saved to my design account. A man stooped to pick it up and tweeted a picture of it to his followers. When Oliver reached for the fluttering paper, a volunteer intercepted politely and said, "Hi, do you want to sign this guest book? We're collecting responses." The volunteer's hand was steady. Oliver's hand paused, then withdrew. He didn't want to touch it. He didn't want the image of him touching the paper to exist, because images are evidence when your whole life is a curated composition. A woman in a beaded gown looked at the document, then at Oliver, then back at the document. "This says Amelia's name," she said. "Isn't Amelia the one who taught the workshop downtown?" Oliver's smile cracked. He leaned forward, voice lowering. He started explaining about team and partnership and complex contracts, but he sounded small. The influencer's live commentary made sure to repeat the exact phrases from the documents. A dozen phones recorded his words verbatim. By the time Oliver made it into his waiting car, the sculpture had done its work. The city's social feed had a new thread, and the gallery of his achievements on his own social accounts flickered with new captions. People were commenting, tagging friends and asking, "Is this true?" It would have been tempting to let the night be noisy and go home. But the monument was not an isolated stunt. It was a microphone for the rest of the archive. We had prepared a website with the scanned documents and a press packet. The server went live as the first photos trended. Within an hour, the local paper published an online piece with the headline, "Public Art Unveils Documents That Question a Leading Innovator's Narrative." The article linked to our packet. The sculpture stayed up for 4 days before the city took it down for maintenance. In that time, the digital trail we had curated mattered more than the physical object. Photos, document copies, and our artist statements circulated. The city had seen an object that made people gather. The crowd had done the rest. The sculpture was the stutter that preceded language. Once the documents were in public, things stopped being a single man's control and became a chorus. Within 48 hours, a small investor emailed the local paper, asking for clarification. She had been introduced to the project a year earlier and had documents that didn't match the narrative Oliver gave in a promotional deck. She hired a lawyer. The manufacturer, a large corporate concern who had signed the 10-year exclusivity, quietly emailed a request for a meeting with their legal counsel. It was the manufacturer meeting that mattered most. They had assumed, as corporations habitually do, that the person who signs is the person who owns. When they saw the timeline, they called for an audit. Audits are moving vans for secrets. Oliver was suddenly handling a dozen threads he couldn't charm away. He sent carefully worded statements and asked for mediation. He called me twice, voice pressed low and earnest. He told me about how things had become messy and asked if we could talk privately. I read his emails like weather reports. They suggested storms but were not themselves the storm. His charm had been his craft. It had allowed him to persuade people to step into narratives that favored him. But evidence is a stubborn thing. When a corporation's legal team hunts, it finds answers in bank statements and chain of custody logs. What I didn't anticipate was Oliver's counterattack. He hired a crisis PR team that began to produce a stream of statements and feature pieces that painted him as a visionary under attack. He arranged interviews where he spoke about mentorship and the difficulty of scaling a startup. His narrative had locomotion. It moved fast and had the muscle to turn sympathy into momentum. But PR works best when there's no evidence. With documents circulating, the narrative was porous. The manufacturer paused production and initiated a review. The investor asked for refunds. The human cost of this process became clear fast. People you thought were allies expressed discomfort. For me, the cost was emotional. Every time I thought the work might bring closure, I saw a new headline with Oliver explaining how complicated collaboration is. He'd learned the language of ambiguity and used it as armor. But each time he explained away a detail, another document would emerge. The legal team mapped the chain, and more people were willing to hand over emails they'd kept. Something surprising happened in the middle of the chaos. A former employee of his, not a close confidant but someone who had been on the edge of visibility, sent me a message with a scanned folder. It contained invoices showing payments to a personal account that had nothing to do with the company. They were gifts in the ledger. Small amounts, marked as reimbursable, but funneled in ways that didn't make sense. The former employee told me quietly that she'd been paid to keep quiet. She was guilt-worn and wanted to help. She feared the fallout for herself but wanted the truth on record. She agreed to a recorded interview, off the record until the legal teams made it otherwise. I had to be careful. Oliver's team tried to paint me as a vindictive ex who had created a spectacle out of private matters. But my allies had documents. The manufacturer had concerns about IP. People who had once smiled at Oliver with trust were now asking for receipts. What I learned in this period is that people respond to pressure. Investors respond to risk. Corporations respond to PR problems. When the possible loss becomes visible, the world that protects a charismatic man starts to shift. Oliver's first fall wasn't cinematic. The manufacturer paused the exclusivity contract pending legal review. One of his board members, who had always prized stability, met with the corporation's counsel and asked blunt questions. Boards, I've observed, are fragile things. A single concerned member can cause proceedings. 1 month into the inquiry, the manufacturer issued a statement that read like legal weather. We are reviewing the terms of the agreement. We are committed to fair practices. In practice, that meant production halted, shipment dates slipped, and teeth behind promises showed. The board called for a meeting. Oliver sat at his window and called me a few times, but he also began to miss dinners, press events, and membership circles. Absences matter in public life. People start to notice and fill the space with rumor. The lawsuit came from an unexpected quarter. A contractor who'd worked on the early prototypes filed a small claim for unpaid invoices. He had been ignored publicly for months. The contractor's attorney found the paperwork in my archive and traced it to the accounts. It wasn't a suit that would append a corporate empire, but it was a seed that, when multiplied, could become a forest. Once liabilities existed on paper, the board couldn't pretend there were none. It forced conversations. For the first time since the launch, Oliver looked unprepared. He had grown accustomed to the art of improvisation and talking around facts until people believed him. But when improvisation meets the law, it loses the rhythm. By the third month of the controversy, the board had made a move I had suspected but not hoped for. They temporarily suspended Oliver's decision-making authority pending an audit. It was a small bureaucratic step, but in the ecosystem of corporate myths, it was a decapitation. Without authority, he could not sign deals. Without deals, the machine of his public persona slowed. It was not enough. Not yet. With the board limiting his authority and a chorus of audits in motion, Oliver shifted from confidence to damage control. He used every tactic his PR team taught him: open letters and make an offer to make amends, while never specifying how. The manufacturer's legal review revealed clauses that were more complicated than anyone had expected. Contracts signed years earlier did not always reflect the origin of ideas. Contracts, I learned, have the power to create realities. Sometimes those realities can be unmade by evidence. A major turning point happened when one of Oliver's former collaborators, who had initially been reluctant to speak, agreed to give testimony. He produced a draft of a product brief with my name and design notes in the metadata. In an era where files carry timestamps, metadata is an inconvenient truth. It cannot be polished. Simultaneously, a long-form feature in a regional magazine decided to run an investigative piece about the artistic culture in our city. The writer, thorough and sympathetic, interviewed a dozen people, gave names, and connected the dots. Their piece was a narrative: a charming man, the rising star, and the quiet designer who taught him the craft. 2 weeks later, a quiet memo circulated: Oliver was temporarily suspended from his role pending the conclusion of these inquiries. The phrasing was careful, but suspensions carry the smell of finality. One night, a journalist texted me a screenshot of an email Oliver had sent via his corporate account. It was a draft proposal bearing his signature and a paragraph with my early sketches pasted inline. The draft had been left unsent, which, in that small human error, revealed the truth. His mind had been there, but he had agreed to a narrative that excluded me. When his suspension became public, the world reacted in ways I did not fully anticipate. Some people were relieved that justice had a language. Others were angry on his behalf, seeing him as a fallen titan. Social feeds polarized into factions. I received a torrent of messages, some supportive, some venomous. People I loved were dragged into opinions they hadn't asked for. Marisol got hate mail. The contractor who had sued received threats. Public truth sometimes feels like a net that tangles everyone. In the midst of the lawsuits and negotiations, something more private happened to me. The public vindication did not feel like freedom at first. It felt, oddly, like new work. I had spent so long building an exterior that I had neglected the interior. What this meant for me as a maker, beyond being right. Oliver's downfall came in stages, and the final stage was painfully public. The Chamber of Commerce rescinded an invitation he had received. A feature piece on his company's legacy philanthropy vanished from the next issue as advertisers pulled out. He gave an interview where his voice had the brittle edge of someone making apologies that didn't land. The public is fickle, but it also has a way of remembering facts when you hand them over like evidence. One evening, months after the sculpture had first stood in that cold light, I walked past the spot where it had been. The city had returned the space to its neutral decals and foot traffic, but people still remembered. I sat on a bench and looked at my hands. They had calluses from welding and from carrying boxes. They were the same hands that had held sketches and scanned invoices. I called Marisol and we had dinner. We told stories about the small miseries of the fight. It felt less like gloating and more like cleaning up. The day the final settlement terms were signed, I sat in a room with my lawyer and watched a document that read like acknowledgement. It wasn't perfect, but it carried my name in places it had been missing. It acknowledged authorship and allowed me to publish my original designs under my name. It awarded restitution that would help the small studio restart. The city provided a small grant to fund a community workshop on creative ethics. The manufacturer agreed to a line of products credited in a way that had transparency built in. We had won institutional changes that would make it less likely but not impossible for someone to be erased in the future. Oliver, I learned, left the city. He took a position at a smaller firm in another state. He tried to rebuild under different lights. I do not hate him. Instead, I feel recognition for a man who chose narrative over people, and who paid that cost. On the mornings I teach, I keep a small object on my desk, a sliver of gilded metal, polished where hands have held it. It is the mask, repurposed into a lamp. It is not a trophy in my home. It's a tool that reminds me that the light we make should illuminate, not blind. I wrote this because people told me to, and because the next person should know that you can make things again after someone takes a story. You can build monuments out of proofs, not to celebrate vengeance, but to reshape a city's memory so that your name sits where your hands once were. And when you finally build something that speaks, make it so beautiful and precise that people can't help but read the wiring.